My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in a stockroom counting linens, and she said the word postponed, like she was telling me the dry cleaning would be a day late. "We need to move your reception, sweetheart, just the venue. The wedding itself is still happening, obviously." My name is Dana Whitfield. I was 31 years old, 3 weeks from my wedding day, holding a clipboard in a building I owned and had never told my own mother I owned. And she was explaining to me that my sister's engagement party needed my reception hall more than I did. "Brooke and Connor want to do it at Magnolia House," she said. It's such a special place for the family, and honestly, Dana, it's not like your wedding is the only important thing happening this year." I stood there with a stack of folded napkins in my hands, and I didn't say a word for a long moment. Not because I didn't have one, because I was doing math, the kind of math my family had never once asked me to explain, because they'd never once asked me what I actually did for a living. "Okay," I said, "take the date." My mother sounded almost disappointed that I wasn't fighting her. "Don't be like that, Dana. It's just a restaurant. It's not a shrine." I hung up the phone, set down the napkins, and looked around the dining room of Magnolia House. The chandeliers I'd restored, the original brick I'd uncovered behind 40 years of bad renovation, the kitchen I'd rebuilt from a gutted shell 2 years ago, with money nobody in my family knew I had. And I smiled, because my mother had just told my sister she could have my wedding reception in a building my sister didn't know I owned. Welcome to Family Revenge Co., where the quiet ones are never as powerless as their families believe. If you like stories about boundaries, dignity, and the truth arriving exactly on time, stay with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the moment it turns. To understand why I let my mother take that date without a fight, you have to go back further than 3 weeks. You have to go back to the beginning. Because the call itself wasn't really about a venue. It was the final sentence in a story my family had been writing about me since I was 7 years old, and I'd just heard it said out loud, plainly, for the first time. I am the second daughter of Carol and Richard Whitfield, born 2 years after my sister Brooke, in a house in a quiet suburb outside Richmond, where my father sold insurance and my mother ran the kind of household where everything had a place and a name and an order of importance. Brooke was first in nearly all of it. First grandchild on both sides. First to walk, first to talk in full sentences, first to be told, in the particular language families use without ever quite saying it, that she was the one worth watching. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's true, and because understanding it is the only way to understand what I did 3 weeks before my wedding. Brooke was luminous in the way some children just are. Funny at the dinner table, easy to photograph, the kind of kid who made adults lean down to talk to her instead of past her. I was quieter. I liked numbers and small mechanical things. The inside of a toaster, the way a cash register drawer worked when my grandmother let me play shopkeeper at her kitchen table. My mother used to say fondly that I was the practical one, which I understand now was already a smaller box than the one Brooke got to live in. The pattern set early and never really broke. When I was 9 and Brooke was 11, our elementary school put on a spring talent show, and Brooke sang a solo that brought half the gymnasium to its feet. My parents talked about it for weeks. I had built, that same semester, a working model of a pulley system for the science fair that won first place in my division. A small blue ribbon I still have somewhere in a box. My father shook my hand at the dinner table that night, the way you'd congratulate a colleague, and then the conversation turned, within minutes, back to which dress Brooke should wear for the regional choir audition the following month. I didn't begrudge her the audition. I begrudged the speed with which the room moved past me to get there. By the time we were teenagers, the roles had calcified into something almost ceremonial. Brooke got the family meetings when she went through a breakup at 16. My parents sat with her on the back porch for an hour, my mother making tea, my father uncharacteristically patient. When I had my own heartbreak 2 years later, my mother's advice was brisk and practical. You'll be fine. You're tough. You don't need to make a big thing of it. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, hearing that and understanding, with a 13-year-old's sudden clarity, that being called tough wasn't a compliment in my family. It was a release valve. It meant, we don't need to spend our attention here, she'll absorb it. I want to give you one more memory, because it's the one that explains everything that came after. even though at the time it seemed small. I was 17, and I'd saved 9 months of money from a hostess job at a local diner to buy myself a second-hand car, a battered little Honda with a cracked side mirror and a check engine light. I'd already diagnosed myself as a loose gas cap because I'd started, even then, to understand that most problems just take patience and the willingness to actually look. I drove it home from the dealership glowing with a kind of pride I hadn't felt about anything before. My father walked around it once, nodded, and said, "Good, now you can drive your sister to her SAT prep on Saturdays." That was the whole conversation. Not "how did you save that much?" Not "I'm proud of you." Just an immediate, unspoken absorption of the thing I'd built into the machinery of taking care of Brooke. I drove Brooke to SAT prep every Saturday that spring. I never said anything about it because saying something about it would have confirmed what I was starting to suspect, that nobody was going to ask. If I wanted anything in that house to stay mine, I was going to have to stop announcing it. That's the lesson I carried into adulthood, and it's the lesson that built Magnolia House eventually, in total silence. When I told my parents at 22 that I wanted to work in restaurants instead of pursuing the marketing degree my mother had quietly assumed I'd use, my father laughed, not unkindly. Just the way you laugh at something you've already decided isn't serious. Waitressing, he called it, for years afterward, no matter how many times I corrected him. Hospitality management, then operations, then eventually ownership. He never updated the word, even after I'd been promoted twice. To my family, I was always just the daughter who carried plates, the same way I'd always been the daughter who drove her sister to SAT prep. Useful, dependable, and somehow never quite worth a follow-up question. What I actually did over the 8 years that followed was build a career most people in my industry would call enviable. I started as a server at 19 at a busy regional steakhouse, the kind of job people think of as a placeholder, and I treated like a classroom. I watched how the floor moved during a Friday night rush, how a good manager could read a room of 40 tables at once, how a bad lease could quietly bankrupt a beautiful restaurant within 2 years, no matter how good the food was. I became a shift lead, then a floor manager, then, at 26, operations director for a small regional restaurant group with 4 locations across 2 states. I learned liquor licensing law. I learned how commercial leases actually worked, the difference between triple net and gross, the clauses that protect a tenant and the ones that quietly don't. I learned, most importantly, that the people who survive in this industry long-term are the ones who eventually stop renting the ground they stand on and find a way to own it. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Eleanor who I adored with the kind of uncomplicated love you only really have room for as a child, used to take Brooke and me to a restaurant called Magnolia House every single Sunday, after church, for as long as I could remember, until she passed when I was 24. It was a beautiful old building, original brick, tall windows, the kind of place that had clearly once been something grander than the slowly fading restaurant it had become by the time I was an adult. Every important Whitfield occasion happened there by a kind of unspoken family tradition. Anniversaries, birthdays, the dinner the night before Brooke's high school graduation. It was, without question, the one place that belonged to all of us equally. The one location where I never once felt like the daughter standing slightly outside the frame of the family photo. 3 years before the call that started this story, I found out, through an industry contact I trusted, that Magnolia House was quietly for sale, off-market, the kind of deal you only hear about if you're already deep enough in the business to be in the room when those conversations happen. The owner by then was an elderly man named Pete Caro who'd run it for almost 3 decades and let the roof, the plumbing, and the books fall apart at roughly the same rate, more out of grief than negligence, I think, after his wife passed. He wanted out quietly, without an auction, without a sign in the window that would make the neighborhood start asking questions about what was happening to a building people loved. I didn't tell my family I was buying it. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than the purchase itself. I didn't keep it secret out of shame. I kept it secret because I already knew, with total certainty, exactly how that conversation would go if I had it before closing. My father would ask where I'd gotten the money, in a tone that assumed recklessness rather than a decade of saving. My mother would worry out loud about risk in a way that wasn't really about risk at all. It would be about not quite believing her quiet, practical daughter could do something this large, this permanent, this much hers. I'd watched it happen with smaller things my whole life. A car that became a chauffeur service for my sister. A promotion that got 4 words at dinner before the conversation moved on. I didn't want to hand them the chance to make this smaller too, before it even had the chance to be mine. So I didn't ask for their faith. I didn't need it. I closed on Magnolia House through a holding company I'd formed for exactly this purpose, Cobblestone Hospitality Group, LLC, a name that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in my family, a name I'd chosen specifically because it gave nothing away. I spent the next 18 months rebuilding the place room by room, working alongside contractors I trusted, spending the kind of money that required liquidating almost everything I'd saved since I was 19 years old. My retirement contributions, a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never touched, every bonus I'd been paid in 6 years at the restaurant group. I rewired the chandeliers myself on weekends because I'd learned basic electrical work from a contractor friend and didn't want to pay out the budget on something I could do carefully on my own time. I stripped 4 layers of bad paint off the original brick with my own hands over the course of one very long February. I reopened it 18 months later under the same name it had always carried, Magnolia House, restored instead of replaced because I never wanted to erase what it had meant to my family. I just wanted to be the one quietly holding it up. My family kept eating there. That's the part that still makes me laugh a little when I think about it now. They had no idea the woman who sometimes refilled their wine on a Sunday afternoon just to keep her hands in the work she still loved, even after she could afford to hire it all out, was the one who'd signed the mortgage. My mother once complimented the new lighting fixtures to a hostess who happened to be me on a slow night, filling in because someone had called out sick. "Aren't these gorgeous?" she said, looking up at the chandelier I'd rewired with my own hands 8 months earlier, standing 2 feet from the daughter who'd done it, having no idea. I'm telling you all of this, the SAT prep, the car, the blue ribbon nobody asked about, the chandelier my own mother praised without recognizing my hands in it, because I need you to understand that by the time my mother called me on that Tuesday afternoon to take my wedding reception away and hand it to my sister, she wasn't doing anything new. She was doing the exact same thing she'd been doing my entire life. The only difference this time was that I finally had something large enough and quiet enough for the truth to actually mean something when it finally arrived. Family Revenge Co. Episode 1. My family canceled my wedding reception to throw my sister's engagement party. Part 2 of 4. I should tell you about Marcus before I go further, because he's the only person who knew the full truth of who I was during those years. And understanding our relationship is part of understanding why I was able to stay quiet for so long without it eating me alive. I met Marcus Reyes 4 years ago at a hospitality industry conference of all places, the kind of dull regional event with bad coffee and worse name tags. He was there representing a commercial insurance firm that handled liability coverage for restaurant groups. And I was there representing nobody but myself, 3 months into owning Magnolia House, and still terrified I'd made the most expensive mistake of my life. We ended up at the same table during a panel on commercial kitchen fire code compliance, which is not, generally, where people fall in love, but somewhere between his dry jokes about insurance adjusters and my unprompted rant about the building permit office in our county, something clicked. What mattered most, in the years that followed, was that Marcus was the first person in my adult life who didn't need the story softened for him. When I told him, on our 3rd date, that I owned a restaurant outright, free and clear of any partners, that I'd built it from a gutted shell with my own savings, he didn't ask where I'd gotten the money in that suspicious tone my father used. He asked how I'd learned to do the wiring myself. He asked what the hardest part of the renovation had been. He asked, and this is the detail I've never forgotten, whether I was proud of it. Nobody had ever asked me that question directly before. I cried in the car afterward, parked outside my own apartment, for reasons I didn't fully understand until years later. I'd spent my whole life building things that nobody thought to ask me about, and here was a man asking on the 3rd date. Marcus knew about Cobblestone Hospitality Group. He knew the building's real ownership history. He'd watched me rewire chandeliers and argue with contractors and cry exactly once, during a brutal stretch 18 months into the renovation, when the kitchen flooded and I genuinely believed I'd lose everything. What Marcus didn't fully understand, not at first, was why I hadn't told my family. It took him almost a year of quietly watching the way my mother spoke to me at holidays, the casual dismissals, the constant redirection toward Brooke, the praise for the chandeliers offered directly to my face without recognition, before I stopped asking why and started simply respecting that I had my reasons. There's a second part of this story I haven't told you yet, something that runs underneath everything else, and I think this is the place to tell it, because it explains why the building mattered to me so much more than money or pride. 18 months into owning Magnolia House, around the same time the kitchen flooded, my grandmother's younger sister, my great-aunt Vivian, fell seriously ill. Vivian was the last of my grandmother's generation, a sharp, funny, slightly difficult woman who'd never married, never had children, and had spent the last decade of her life in a modest apartment 2 towns over from my parents, mostly forgotten by the rest of the family except for an obligatory Christmas card. My mother visited her perhaps twice a year, my father almost never. I visited her more than anyone, not out of duty exactly, but because Vivian was the only person left alive who remembered my grandmother the way I did, who could tell me stories about the woman who used to take us to Magnolia House every Sunday, who could fill in the parts of my grandmother's life I'd been too young to ask about myself. When Vivian's health collapsed, a stroke followed by a long, difficult decline, she had almost no savings and no family willing to step in beyond the bare legal minimum. My mother visited the hospital once, stayed 20 minutes, and left saying it was too hard to watch. My father never went at all. I am not telling you this to make villains of my parents. I'm telling you because it's true, and because what happened next is the second secret I'd been carrying quietly for 2 years, the one that ran alongside the restaurant the entire time, woven into the same silence. I paid for Vivian's care. Not loudly, not as a grand gesture anyone was meant to notice. I simply took over the financial side of her final 18 months the way I'd taken over everything else in my life that mattered. Quietly, efficiently, and without asking anyone's permission or approval first. A private room instead of the shared one her minimal coverage would have provided. A part-time home health aide for the months she was able to stay in her apartment instead of a facility. The kind of physical therapy that insurance fights and delays and denies until a family either gives up or pays out of pocket. I paid out of pocket. Every month, an invoice arrived under a billing name that wasn't mine, the same way I'd structured the restaurant purchase, because by then it had simply become how I operated. I did not want anyone, not my parents, not Vivian herself, who would have been horrified and proud and stubborn about refusing it, to know where the money was coming from. Vivian died 14 months ago, in a clean private room with good pain management, and with me sitting beside her holding her hand at the end, the same way I would, a year later, sit beside my own decisions about Magnolia House without anyone in my family understanding the thread that connected the two. At her small funeral, 12 people, most of them neighbors, my mother cried the appropriate amount and told the few people who asked that the family had done everything we could for Vivian at the end. I stood 3 feet away and said nothing, because correcting her at a funeral would have made me exactly the kind of person who needs credit to feel whole, and I had already decided, long before that day, that I wasn't going to be that person. I had learned, the same year I closed on Magnolia House, that some of the most important things you do in this life are things nobody will ever know you did. I had decided I could live with that. I had decided, more than that there was a strange and durable kind of strength in it. Being the root nobody sees, holding something up in the dark and asking nothing in return. I tell you about Vivian here, in the middle of this story, because I need you to understand something about the kind of silence I'd built my whole adult life around. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't a slow-burning resentment waiting for its moment. It was, until that Tuesday afternoon phone call, something closer to peace. I had made an actual, deliberate choice to be quietly generous with the people in my life who needed it. Vivian, eventually my own restaurant staff, eventually, I hoped, my own future children, without requiring applause for any of it. I genuinely believed I could go my whole life that way, content to be underestimated, content to hold things up that nobody knew I was holding. What I didn't expect was for that same quiet pattern. The chandeliers nobody recognized as mine, the invoices under someone else's billing name, the entire architecture of a life built in the dark, to collide, on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with my own wedding. The call came at 2:40 in the afternoon. I remember the time specifically because I'd just finished a vendor call about our final linen order and was standing in the Magnolia House stockroom doing inventory, which is exactly the kind of unglamorous, hands-on work I still did myself 2 years after I could have afforded to hire someone else to do it. My phone buzzed against a folded stack of napkins. My mother's name on the screen, which at 3 weeks out from my wedding, I assumed meant flowers or seating charts or some small detail she wanted to weigh in on the way she'd weighed in, gently and constantly, on every choice Brooke had ever made and almost none of mine. "Dana, honey, do you have a minute?" "Sure, Mom, what's up?" "So this is going to sound like a lot, but hear me out, okay?" The particular brightness in her voice, the one she used when she'd already decided something and was performing the consultation rather than actually having it. Brooke and Connor got engaged officially. Well, you know that, obviously, but they want to do the engagement party properly. A real party. And Connor's parents are flying in from Seattle. And honestly, with everyone traveling, it just makes the most sense to do it somewhere really special. Somewhere that means something to the family. I already knew, somehow, before she said it. The particular careful phrasing, "somewhere that means something to the family," was the linguistic fingerprint of a decision that had already been made and was now being delivered to me as a discussion. "We were thinking Magnolia House," she said. I know, it's such short notice, but here's the thing. Your reception's not until next month, and Brooke and Connor's window with his parents in town is so much tighter. We need to move your reception, sweetheart. Just the venue. The wedding itself is still happening, obviously." I stood there with a stack of folded napkins in my hands and looked out across the dining room I had personally watched go from a gutted, water-damaged shell to the room currently bathed in soft afternoon light through windows I'd had custom restored to match the original 1920s frames. I didn't say anything for a long moment, not because I didn't have anything to say. Because I was doing math, the kind of math my family had never once asked me to explain. The kind I'd been quietly doing about this family's priorities since I was 9 years old and won a science fair. Nobody mentioned past dinner. "Okay," I said finally. "Take the date." There was a pause on the other end, the particular silence of someone who'd braced for an argument and found herself, instead, slightly disappointed not to get one. "Don't be like that, Dana. It's just a restaurant. It's not a shrine." 6 words that did more work than my mother could possibly have understood. It's just a restaurant. As if the building meant nothing beyond its function. As if it hadn't been my grandmother's Sunday ritual, my own 18 months of sweat and savings, and a flooded kitchen I'd cried over alone at midnight, the place I'd quietly decided, the moment I closed on it, would someday host my own wedding the way it had hosted every important Whitfield gathering before me. Not a shrine. Just a restaurant my mother could swap out like a dinner reservation, the same way she'd swapped out my SAT prep Saturdays for Brooke's convenience 17 years earlier, the same way she'd swapped my blue ribbon for a choir audition at the dinner table when I was 9. "Sure, Mom," I said. "Whatever works best for everyone." We talked logistics for another minute. She wanted to confirm I wasn't upset. I assured her, calmly and honestly, that I understood. And then we hung up, and I stood alone in the stockroom of a building she didn't know was mine, holding a stack of napkins, and I smiled. Not a happy smile, something closer to recognition. My mother had just told my sister she could have my wedding reception in a building my sister didn't know I owned, and for the first time in my entire life, I understood with total clarity that the next move in this particular pattern was finally, completely, mine to make. I called Marcus that evening and told him what happened. He went quiet on the other end of the line the way he does when he's furious, and trying not to scare me with it. "So what do we do?" he said. "Tell them, tonight, right now. Dana, this is insane. They took your wedding venue and gave it to your sister and they don't even know whose building it is." "No," I said, and I meant it, though it took me a minute to find the words for why. If I tell them now, this becomes a fight about me, about what I have, what I've built, whether I'm being petty about a restaurant. I don't want that. I want them to walk into that room on Brooke's engagement night exactly the way they would have walked into it on my wedding night and enjoy every single second of it without knowing anything's different. And then I want them to find out the only way that's ever actually meant anything in this family. On their own, looking at the paperwork, the way I had to learn everything that ever mattered to me. The hard way, with nobody explaining it to me first. Marcus didn't love the plan. He sat with it for a long time on the phone, and I could hear him turning it over, the careful, deliberate way he processes things that don't sit easily with him. "You're not doing this to hurt Brooke," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "No," I said. "I'm doing this because I'm done being the daughter nobody asks. And I think the only way they'll ever actually understand that is if I let them find out exactly what they almost took from me, instead of telling them and watching them argue about whether I'm overreacting." He trusted me the way he always had, since the day I told him about buying the building in the first place, and he'd asked what I needed from him instead of asking why I hadn't told anyone. "Okay," he said. "What do you need from me?" 3 weeks of you not telling my mother you secretly think she's terrible," I said, and he laughed finally, the tension breaking. "And maybe help me figure out the seating chart for our actual wedding, since apparently I still need a venue." "Dana," his voice went serious again, "you already have a venue." I did. I'd always had a venue, my family just didn't know it yet. Here's something nobody outside the hospitality industry understands about a building like Magnolia House. Booking it isn't like booking a restaurant table for 6. For an event of Brooke's size, she'd invited 80 guests, full sit-down dinner, an open bar, a string quartet for the cocktail hour because Connor's mother had always dreamed of live music. There's a private events contract, a deposit, liability terms, cancellation clauses, a signature line for the responsible party. My mother had handled the original booking for my own wedding reception months earlier through our event coordinator, a sharp, kind woman named Priya Anand, who'd worked for me for just over a year and had absolutely no reason to think anything was strange about a family swapping one Whitfield event for another. Families did that sort of thing all the time, moving a graduation party, combining a birthday with an anniversary. To Priya, it would look like nothing more than ordinary scheduling. When my mother called Priya directly to move the date from my reception to Brooke's engagement party, Priya did exactly what any good coordinator does. She drew up a new private events contract under the new client's name, Carol Whitfield, my mother, since she was the one organizing and paying the deposit, and, per our standard policy for any event above 40 guests, she routed it through to ownership for the final sign-off that happens on every booking of that size before it's confirmed. Ownership was me. I want to tell you about the moment I actually sat down and read that contract because it's the closest I came, in 3 weeks, to losing my nerve entirely. It was a Thursday evening, 4 days after the original phone call, and I was in my small office at the back of Magnolia House, the same office where I'd signed the closing documents on the building itself 2.5 years earlier. When Priya's standard approval email landed in my inbox with its usual subject line, "New private event, pending owner sign-off," I almost didn't open it that night. I'd had a long day, a delivery had come in short, and I genuinely considered leaving it for the weekend. But something made me click it open right then, sitting alone in that small office with the dining room dark and quiet beyond my door. Event name, Whitfield Brooke Engagement Celebration. 80 guests, full dining room buyout, deposit, $4,000 paid by Carol Whitfield. Date, the exact date that had, until 4 days earlier, belonged to my own wedding reception. I sat there for a long time with my hand on the mouse, not moving. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something closer to grief, a strange, specific grief for the version of that night I'd imagined for 2 years, walking into my own reception in the building I'd rebuilt with my own hands, watching my family enjoy a space they had no idea was a gift from the daughter they'd always underestimated. That version of the night was gone now, and in its place was this, a contract with my mother's signature on it, for my sister's party, in my building, on what should have been my date. I could have stopped it right there. I had full authority, as ownership, to decline any event for any reason, no questions required. Part of me, a tired, smaller part, the part that was still 9 years old, holding a blue ribbon nobody asked about, wanted to write back to Priya and say, Actually, this event can't be approved. There's a conflict, and let my mother find out exactly why in the most uncomfortable way possible, immediately, without 3 more weeks of waiting. I didn't do that. I sat with the contract for almost 20 minutes, and then I thought about what I actually wanted out of this. Not punishment, not a scene, but the truth finally landing somewhere. It couldn't be talked around or absorbed or quietly forgotten the way every other slight in my life had been absorbed. A contract declined over email would just become another argument about my feelings. I wanted my family to stand in that room, enjoying it, before they understood what it had cost me to let them. I signed the approval. I told Priya simply to handle it exactly the way she would any other client, and to loop me in only if anything unusual came up. The unusual thing very nearly happened 11 days before the party. Priya and I were going over final floral approvals for the Whitfield Brook event. I was, as I am for every significant booking at Magnolia House, personally signing off on the centerpieces because I still care, 2.5 years in, about every detail of that room. When she mentioned, casually, flipping through her tablet, "Your mom's been so sweet to work with, by the way. She keeps saying how much this place means to your family. Did you guys grow up coming here or something?" "Something like that," I said. "That's so nice." Priya tapped through to the next screen. She did ask me something kind of funny yesterday, actually. She asked if the owner, Cobblestone, whatever the LLC is called, if the owner might want to stop by and say hello during the party, since the family's been coming here so long. I told her I'd check with you. My stomach dropped in a way I hadn't anticipated. This was the near miss, the moment the entire architecture of my plan nearly collapsed 11 days early, by total accident, because my mother, out of nothing more than polite curiosity, the kind of small talk she'd make with any business she frequented, had asked an entirely reasonable question that I had simply failed to account for. I kept my voice level. "I'll be there working that night anyway," I said. "Tell her ownership prefers to stay behind the scenes for private events. It's just our policy." Priya nodded, unbothered, already moving to the next item on her list, and the moment passed the way most near misses do, quietly, with nobody but me aware of how close it had come to unraveling everything 3 weeks ahead of schedule. But it shook me. I drove home that night gripping the steering wheel harder than I needed to, replaying it, understanding for the first time just how fragile a secret this size actually was, and how many small, ordinary moments could have ended it without anyone meaning for them to. I called Marcus from the car. "I almost got caught today," I told him, and explained what happened. He was quiet for a second, then he said the thing that actually settled me back down. "Dana, even if she finds out early, it doesn't change what's true. The building's still yours. The choice you made is still real. You're not protecting a lie. You're protecting the timing of a truth. That's different." I held on to that the rest of the way home. I'm not protecting a lie. I'm protecting the timing of a truth. A few days after the floral near miss, I did something I hadn't planned on doing, but which I think, looking back, I needed. I went to see my accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Cole, who'd handled my books since the day I closed on the building, to walk through exactly what would happen, legally and financially, if my family somehow discovered the ownership structure for the party and tried to make a scene, cancel, or accuse me of something underhanded. I wanted to understand my own position cold, the way I'd want any client of mine to understand theirs, before walking into a hard conversation. Renata pulled up the LLC documents on her screen and walked me through it the way she always does. Calm, precise, no wasted words. "Legally, you're in the clear on every front," she said. "Cobblestone owns the building outright, no partners, no family on the deed, nothing that gives anyone a claim to anything. Your mother signed a standard events contract with your business, same as any other client would. There's no fraud here, Dana. You didn't deceive anyone about terms or pricing. You just didn't volunteer information nobody asked you for." She looked at me over her glasses. "The only question that actually matters isn't legal. It's what you want this to do to your family when it lands." "I want them to understand what they almost threw away," I said. "Not the building." "Me," Renata nodded slowly, the way she does when a client said something true rather than just something correct. "Then make sure the moment does that," she said. "Paperwork tells the truth, but it doesn't comfort anyone. If you want this to land as clarity instead of just a wound, you'll need to be in the room for the part that comes after the contract does its work." I left her office that afternoon with something I hadn't quite had before. Not just a plan, but an intention. I didn't want to humiliate my family in front of 80 guests. I wanted the truth to arrive cleanly, privately enough that nobody but the people who needed to understand it would be standing in the room when it did, and then I wanted to be present enough afterward to let it actually mean something instead of just hurting. The 2 weeks that followed moved strangely, both faster and slower than I expected. I spent them the way I spend every stretch of pressure in my life, working. I oversaw the final preparations for Brooke's engagement party the same way I oversee every significant event in my building, because that's my job, whether my family knew it yet or not. I approved the floral order Priya had asked about, soft blush peonies, Brooke's favorite, which I knew because I am, despite everything, a sister who pays attention even when nobody believes I am. I signed off on the bar package, the string quartet's setup requirements, the seating chart that placed Connor's parents at the head table beside my own. Nobody in my family asked in those 2 weeks where I would be having my reception instead. Not once. I told my mother lightly that I'd figured something out, and she said, "Good, I'm glad. This works out so much better for everyone," and that was the entire extent of the conversation. I want you to sit with that, the way I had to sit with it, because it tells you everything about how this family ranked my life against everyone else's. A person displaced from their own wedding venue 3 weeks before the wedding does not, in most families, get a single follow-up question. In mine, you absorb the inconvenience and keep your mouth shut, because that's the role you've been assigned since you were old enough to drive your sister to SAT prep. The night of the party finally arrived on a warm Saturday in late September. I didn't go as a guest the way I never go to my own events as a guest. I arrived early, in the back, in a black blazer instead of the dress I'd have worn if I'd been attending as family, walking the dining room floor an hour before doors to make sure every table setting matched the diagram, every wine glass sat at the correct angle, every candle was lit at the right height. This is genuinely who I am, the woman who checks the centerpieces herself, even when she could pay someone else to do it, because the building still feels, after 2.5 years, like the most honest thing I've ever made. Priya found me checking the wine inventory in the back hallway about 40 minutes before guests were due to arrive. "You know you don't have to be here tonight, right?" she said gently, tablet under her arm. "This is your sister's engagement party. You could just come as family, sit at the table, let me run the floor." "I want to make sure everything's perfect," I told her, which was entirely true. I just didn't tell her why it mattered so much that night specifically that it was. My family began arriving at 7. I watched the dining room fill from the kitchen pass-through, the small service window where I'd once spent an entire week, 18 months earlier, hand-finishing the trim myself because the contractor's crew had botched it twice. My mother walked in first, in a deep green dress, and put her hand to her chest the way she does at things she finds beautiful, taking in the chandeliers I'd rewired, the original brick I'd uncovered behind 40 years of bad renovation, a room she had absolutely no idea her own quiet daughter had built board by board, fixture by fixture, save by save, over 2.5 years of nights and weekends nobody in this family had ever asked her about. My father followed close behind, in a blazer he reserved for occasions he considered important, shaking hands with the maître d', a young man named Tomas who'd worked for me for a year and had absolutely no idea he was shaking hands with his boss's father, like a man arriving somewhere. Significant. Brooke came in last, on Connor's arm, glowing the exact particular way a bride-to-be is supposed to glow on the night that belongs to her, in a blush pink dress that matched the peonies I'd personally approved 2 weeks earlier. Connor's parents trailed behind, wide-eyed and pleased, clearly delighted by the building's old-world charm, completely unaware that the entire room had been resurrected from a gutted, water-damaged shell by the slight, quiet woman currently standing 40 feet away in the kitchen hallway with a clipboard in her hand. I stayed mostly in the back for the first 2 hours, the way I always do during a significant event, checking tickets, tasting sauces, doing the unglamorous, hands-on work that nobody at that party would ever think to associate with the family they'd come to celebrate. I watched my mother laugh too loudly at something Connor's father said. I watched my father stand a little straighter every time a guest complimented the venue, as though the compliments were somehow reflecting on him. I watched Brooke at one point step away from the crowd near the bar and stand alone for a moment by the window, just breathing, the particular private exhaustion of being the center of attention for an entire evening. And for one unguarded second, I almost walked out there and told her everything myself, just her, just the two of us, before any of it had to involve our parents at all. I didn't. I'd built this too carefully to rush the final piece now. Around 9 o'clock, as the dinner service wound down and the string quartet shifted into something softer for the after-dinner drinks, my mother came looking for me in the back. Not out of suspicion, just because she wanted her quiet daughter at the family table for the toasts, the way you'd want any daughter there, even one you'd never quite learn to look for first. She found me in the kitchen hallway with a clipboard in my hand, checking off the dessert course as it went out, and for one long second, her face did something I want to describe carefully, because it mattered more than almost anything else that happened that night. It wasn't recognition yet, it was confusion. The specific disoriented confusion you feel when something deeply familiar appears somewhere it has absolutely no business being. "Dana," she said, "what are you doing back here?" "Working," I said. "Working here? You work here?" And there it was. 2.5 years, hundreds of family meals eaten in that very dining room, and that was the first time my mother had ever asked the question directly, because it had genuinely, sincerely never occurred to her before to ask it. I could have told her everything right there, in a narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room, with a tray of plated tiramisu going slightly soft on the counter behind me. I didn't. I told her gently that I'd explain everything in just a few minutes, and I sent her back out to the party. Then I found Priya by the service station and asked her to do the one thing I'd been planning since the night I sat alone in my office reading my mother's approval contract. To bring the final event folio to the head table at the close of the evening, the way she does for every client, except this time with one extra page tucked behind the receipt. I want to slow down here, because this is the hinge the whole evening turned on, and I think it matters that you understand exactly what I asked Priya to do and why. Every private event at Magnolia House closes the same way, regardless of who's hosting it. A leather folio delivered to the responsible party with the final balance, the itemized charges, and a signature line confirming the night is settled. My mother had put the original deposit down on her own card when she'd called to swap the date from my reception to Brooke's party, which made her, contractually, the responsible party for the entire evening. Her name, her signature, her $4,000, and now the remaining balance for an open bar, a string quartet, and 80 plated dinners. I'd asked Priya 2 days earlier to do one small thing differently than usual. Behind the itemized receipt, I wanted her to include a single additional page, a copy of the recorded property deed for Magnolia House, filed with the county 2.5 years prior. Owner of record, Cobblestone Hospitality Group LLC, sole member Dana Whitfield. I wasn't in the dining room when she opened it. I was back in the kitchen, finishing the last of the dessert plating alongside the pastry chef. When I heard the room go quiet in that particular way, a room goes quiet when something has shifted that the guests can feel before they understand it. Not a dramatic silence, a confused one, the kind that spreads outward from a single table before anyone else even knows what's happened. My father found me first. He came through the swinging kitchen door holding the folio in his hand, the way you'd hold something you were hoping was a misprint, a mistake some overworked clerk could fix if you found the right person fast enough. "Dana," he said, not a question the way it never really was a question in my family. "What is this?" I took the folio from him, calm, and looked down at the page he was jabbing his finger toward, and I said, "That's the deed to the building. I bought it almost 3 years ago." My mother appeared behind him in the doorway a moment later, and behind her Brooke, still in her engagement dress. The blush peonies I'd approved pinned at her wrist, her face doing the same slow, disoriented arithmetic her mother's had done in the hallway an hour earlier. You own Magnolia House," my mother said, her voice climbing. "This whole time?" "This whole time," I said. "But, the wedding." I watched her finally connect it 3 weeks too late, exactly the way I'd known, somewhere in my bones, that she eventually would. "You let us take your wedding venue. You let us throw Brooke's party here, in your building, and you never said a single word." "You told me it wasn't a shrine," I said, "just a restaurant. So I let you have it." I want to be honest about something here because this is the part people get wrong about quiet people in families like mine, the part that's easy to misread as cruelty if you don't understand what actually drove it. I wasn't punishing my sister. Brooke hadn't asked anyone to take my date out from under me. My mother had offered it on her behalf. The same way my mother had been making decisions about which daughter mattered more for as long as I could remember. Going back to a science fair ribbon, nobody mentioned past dinner. Brooke looked, standing there in the kitchen doorway in her engagement dress, genuinely horrified, in a way that told me clearly she hadn't known any of it, hadn't understood what she'd actually been handed 3 weeks earlier. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. I had built this whole reveal carefully enough, I realized in that moment, to make sure it landed on the people who'd actually earned it. Dana, Brooke said, her voice breaking. I didn't. Mom never told me this was your venue. I would never have said yes if I'd known you were losing your own reception for this. I know, I said, and I meant it. My father was the one who got angry, the way he always did when something didn't fit cleanly into the story he'd already decided was true about his family. Why wouldn't you tell us this? He said, his voice rising now, loud enough that a few curious guests near the bar had begun to glance toward the kitchen doorway. Your own family. We've been eating here for years, Dana, years, and you just let us think it belonged to some stranger. Why would you keep something like this from your own parents? I didn't raise my voice. I never do. It isn't how I'm built, and I decided years earlier that I wasn't going to perform an emotion just because the moment seemed to call for it. Because every time I've had something good in this family, it stopped being mine, I said. A car that turned into a chauffeur service for Brooke's SAT prep. A blue ribbon nobody mentioned past dinner. A promotion that got 4 words at the table before the conversation moved on to her wedding dress. I wanted one thing, just one, that was only mine for as long as I decided it was. And then 3 weeks ago, Mom called and told me my wedding reception was less important than Brooke's engagement party. In a building I rebuilt with my own 2 hands and every dollar I'd saved since I was 19 years old, and I realized I didn't owe anyone in this family an explanation for finally protecting the one thing nobody got to touch but me. The dining room beyond the kitchen door had gone strangely quiet. Guests, sensing something had shifted, even if they couldn't hear the words, the string quartet softening into something almost apologetic. My mother stood there with the folio still trembling slightly in her hands, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I watched her actually look at me, not past me toward Brooke, not through me toward whatever task came next, just at me, the way you look at someone you've lived alongside for 31 years and never once properly seen. I'm sorry, she said, quietly, not performed, not pitched for an audience because there wasn't one back there in that narrow hallway to perform for. Just my mother finally saying the thing. I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't, not yet, and I'd promised myself years ago I wouldn't lie just to smooth over a hard moment the way this family always had. I'm not angry that you took the date, I told her, and I found, to my own surprise, that this was true. I'm tired of being the daughter nobody asks. Nobody asked where I'd have my reception instead. Nobody asked if I was okay. You just assumed I'd absorb it, the way I always have, the way I've absorbed everything since I was a kid. I need that to stop. Not the love, Mom. I'm not asking for the love to stop, just the assuming. My father stood there a long moment, the anger slowly draining out of his shoulders, replaced by something that looked, for the first time I could remember, like genuine shame. I called you the practical one your whole life, he said quietly, almost to himself. I think I meant it as a compliment. I'm starting to understand it wasn't one. I didn't answer that. Some things don't need an answer right away. Some things just need to be said out loud, once, by the person who spent 30 years not saying them and left to sit there until they're ready to mean something. What happened in the weeks after the party, I think, matters as much as the night itself, because revenge that doesn't change anything afterward is just a performance, and I've never been interested in performing. Connor's parents, mercifully, never learned what had happened in that kitchen hallway. Priya, with the discretion I'd come to count on her for, kept the conversation contained to family, and the party itself finished cleanly. The string quartet playing the last set, the cake cut, 80 guests going home with no idea that the foundation of the Whitfield family had just quietly cracked open and begun, slowly, to reset itself into something more honest. Brooke called me 3 days later, alone this time, no parents on the line. "I want to actually know you," she said, which sounded like such a small thing and landed like one of the largest things anyone in my family had ever said to me. "I don't even know what you do day to day. I don't know how you learned to rebuild a building. I've eaten at your restaurant probably 200 times, and I never once asked you a single real question about your life." We talked for almost 2 hours that night. The longest conversation we'd had as adults that wasn't centered on her wedding planning, and somewhere in the middle of it she asked if she could come by the restaurant sometime when it was slow, just to see how it actually worked, just to understand the thing I'd built. She has, since then, come by 4 times. She asked good questions. I think, for the first time in our lives, my sister was actually curious about me. My father took longer. He's not a man built for quick apologies, and I didn't expect one. What he did instead, about 2 weeks after the party, was show up at Magnolia House on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, alone, and ask Tomas at the host stand if he could speak to the owner. He stood in the doorway of my small back office, the same office where I'd signed the closing papers 2.5 years earlier, and he looked around at the framed photos on the wall, the building mid-renovation, exposed brick and scaffolding, a photo of me at 28 standing in a hard hat in front of a half-finished kitchen, grinning. He looked at that photo for a long time. "I never saw this," he said finally. "Any of it. I'm sorry, Dana. I think I decided a long time ago what kind of daughter you were, and I stopped looking for evidence that I might be wrong." I told him that meant something to me because it did, and I told him I wasn't interested in relitigating 30 years of dinner table comparisons because I genuinely wasn't. What I wanted, I told him, was simpler, to be asked, going forward, the way you'd ask anyone you respected. "What are you working on? How did you learn that? Are you proud of it?" He has, in the months since, started asking. My mother and I are still working on it, more slowly than the rest. Old patterns don't dissolve in a single hallway conversation, no matter how clean the reveal. But she has started doing something she never used to do, which is pause mid-sentence sometimes when she catches herself comparing me to Brooke out of old habit and correct course before finishing the thought. It's small. It's not nothing. My wedding, 3 weeks after the engagement party, happened exactly where I had always quietly planned it to happen, in the same dining room, under the same chandeliers I'd rewired with my own hands, with the same family sitting at the same tables, except this time, every single one of them knew exactly whose building they were sitting in. My mother cried during the toast, the real kind this time, not the performed kind she'd used my whole childhood to smooth over uncomfortable feelings. My father shook Marcus's hand and told him quietly that he'd misjudged his daughter for longer than he was proud of, and that he hoped Marcus had seen what he'd missed for 31 years. Brooke gave a toast of her own, unprompted, about her sister who'd quietly rebuilt a building with her own hands and never once asked anyone to notice. And I sat there, in the room I'd made, finally watched by the people who'd taken 31 years to learn how to look. I didn't need the apology to feel whole. I'd built Magnolia House for myself, brick by brick, long before any of them knew it existed, and that would have remained true whether they ever found out or not. I want to be clear about that because I think it's the most important thing in this whole story. I didn't build it for this moment. I built it because I needed, somewhere in my life, one thing that was entirely, undeniably mine. The reveal was never the point. It was just the truth. Finally arriving on its own schedule, exactly the way the truth always does if you're patient enough to let it. But I won't pretend the apology didn't matter. It did. There's a particular kind of relief in finally being seen by the people who were supposed to see you first, even if it takes them 31 years and a leather folio to get there. If you've ever built something quietly, in the dark, while the people who were supposed to notice you look the other way, tell me about it in the comments. Because I read every single one, and I want you to know, you are not invisible in your own story. Subscribe to Family Revenge Co., where the quiet ones always get the last word. I'll see you at the next table.